Hello everyone, I'm Abeba Amroselassie, head of the IMF's African Department, welcoming you to Africa's Perspectives, where we discuss pressing economic policy issues faced by the region. Today, I'm greatly honored to introduce Professor Branko Milanovic, who is a senior scholar at the Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality of the City University of New York. He is a pioneer, to put it mildly, on the study of global inequality and economic distribution. His scholarly and empirical work has fundamentally transformed our comprehension of income disparities worldwide, their profound implications for societies across the world. Professor Milanovic is a visionary whose prolific writings, including landmark publications like Capitalism Alone and Visions of Inequality, has offered groundbreaking insights into the mechanics of capitalism and the nuanced landscape of global inequality. In fact, his journey has been instrumental in charting the course of economic thought and policy discourse on inequality in recent years. He served as lead economist in the World Bank's research department for nearly 2 decades before departing to author his seminal work on global income inequality, Worlds Apart, back in 2005. During this time, he also contributed his expertise as a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, and held esteemed teaching positions at the University of Maryland, at Johns Hopkins. Further enriching his academic journey, he embraced roles as visiting scholar at All Souls College in Oxford University and Universidad Carlos III in Madrid. Branko's extensive involvement with leading academic institutions, alongside his pivotal role and groundbreaking research, underscores his unwavering dedication to uncovering the truths behind economic disparities. Branko, welcome to the IMF, and thank you for making time to talk to us.
Well, Abed, thank you very much for this very generous introduction, and also thank you so much for the invitation. It's always a pleasure for me to be in the fund, and always a pleasure to see you and to meet you and to have a discussion.
Likewise. This is not the first time that Branko and I are having a discussion like this, but he's somebody that I personally go to again and again to understand a lot of the policy side of the work that we need to do as an institution. So, Branko, kicking off our discussion, your work has significantly advanced our understanding of global inequality by, explaining and providing a comprehensive overview of how things have evolved. Famously, you're the person behind the elephant graph, which in a very nice way summarized global developments on global inequality. If I could ask, where do things stand at the moment in terms of global inequality?
Well, of course, you very kindly mentioned the elephant graph. The elephant graph was very influential because it essentially confirmed empirically what to some extent we knew intuitively and from reading other articles and so on. But we put, Christoph Lackner and myself, we put the numbers together. And as you mentioned, of course, what they did show in very brief description was that the middle classes in Asian countries, particularly in China, who are not reached by the Western standards, but were around the middle of the global income distribution, they did extremely well. Also, the top 1% did very well. But people who didn't do well were people who were in between in level of income between these two groups, but they were lower parts of the Western countries' income distributions. And they really had either zero growth or very, very modest growth over 20 years, from 1988 to 2008. Well, afterwards, what happened, so that's actually what the chart was, and we were very lucky that basically our end year was the year of the financial crisis, because it really was, as you know, really the high globalization was in that period. What happened afterwards, in very briefly, is that we had continuation of the trends, obviously, with Asian countries, and China now moving more towards higher parts of the global income distribution. We didn't have an improvement in the middle classes of the rich world, but we did have the top 5% never returning to the rates of growth which they enjoyed during the high globalization.
So one question I've always had when, both the elephant chart and then subsequent developments is what we've seen, again, this is sweeping generalization, of course, and there are a lot of nuances. What we've seen basically is intra-country inequality diminishing, mainly because of China, and within country inequality, having widened. I'm talking about over this last 30-40 period. So two questions related to this. I mean, first one is this simply kind of the inherent logic of neoliberalism, capitalism, second, is it more specific to like the China shock, because it's just been such a profound development?
What you said is absolutely true, and actually I always want to emphasize that because we are very much concerned with rising inequality. So when you tell people it's all true, but global inequality went down in the last 20 years, and it went down principally because of China, and then maybe later because of India. But really, let's keep it simple, it was really the China affair. So the difference between countries, if you take mean incomes and do population weighted, because obviously then China is very important, or India, that gap has been reduced. On the other hand, as you were saying, the gaps within nations, generally speaking, have increased compared to what they were, let's suppose, in 1980s or 1990s. And that's obviously the case in China, India, the United States, Russia, until recently in the UK, but it actually changed now. So South Africa, for example, very clearly. Perhaps Nigeria also. So that was really clear. Now, the big question is this really sort of inherently a logic of neoliberalism? To some extent, I would say yes, but of course it's easy to say after the fact. But let me focus out on two things that exactly what you said. The first one, the success of China. Would that success have taken place without neoliberal globalization? I honestly doubt. I think what was absolutely necessary for China is ability to get technology from the United States and the ability to export things, again, to the US and to the rest of the world. So that was really globalization under the neoliberal conditions. Secondly, that same globalization, neoliberalism, was associated with rising income inequality within countries. So it seems to me that there is a certain logic, which is an ideological logic behind these two developments.
So, and what is it that this overall kind of cross-cutting development did? Is it, as you have written, one of the things that we see is the share of capital in many countries having gone up, varied at different levels, but having gone up. I was struck by this actually when I was working on South Africa around 2009-10, how much the share of capital had gone up, much like other emerging market countries. I don't think we compared it to advanced countries. Is it simply that logic, or what other factors could be at work?
I think it is that logic, and I think that the fund actually had a very interesting paper showing really that the increase in the capital share was not only limited to the rich countries, obviously, and China. China had a significant increase in capital share as well, and as you mentioned, South Africa. So that was also part of the capitalist logic, in the sense that, and maybe that would continue with artificial intelligence, which would replace lots of higher skilled labor and then increase the capital share. But if I may just go back briefly to the last question. The reason, I'm glad that you asked it, and glad that I mentioned the neoliberal globalization, because we may be now at the point where that neoliberal globalization is changing, in the sense that rich countries, particularly in the US, are discarding some of the key elements which existed before, which was exactly like low tariff rates, no economic coercion, free trade, and so forth. And if it happens, then everything that we said before regarding China and sort of ability of China to grow at such high rates might be changed. And I think we are really at the end of an era, whether for better or worse, but I think objectively speaking, it seems to me that we are, you know that better than I, but it seems to me that we are at the end of an era.
Okay, okay. I think maybe we'll come back to
Yes,
this
to that
if
before
we have
I-
time,
yeah.
because I really, as much as possible, want to bring this to inequality in Africa,
Right.
Which is, of course, an issue of concern for everybody, I think, particularly us. So shifting gears to Africa and sub-Saharan Africa in particular, if you could tell us a little bit about what is known, what is not known. I appreciate kind of data is a bit scarce. Maybe just with that big picture question.
You know, Africa is, obviously, first of all, it's very hard to speak of Africa because it is very diverse, as you know better. I looked, for example, at the data, and what is interesting, first of all, of course, Africa is relatively poor and it's a continent which has high inequality, generally speaking. However, there is quite a lot of variability between the countries. So if you take a continent of Africa as a whole, you have the highest standard deviation of the Gini coefficients. I know that it sounds really awful as a long word, but simply what I mean is that the Gini coefficients in Africa are not clustered. Compare that with Latin America. Latin America is a very unequal continent, but the Gini coefficients are very similar. Either you're 45 or 50 or 55. But in Africa, there are countries with relatively low inequality, and there are countries, obviously, which are outliers in the world, like South Africa, Namibia, and so on. So it does have this sort of great variability. Now, I know much less, and there are, of course, as you said, the data issues about the trends. And I think only in a few countries where we have data, for example, Ghana has good data, Ethiopia has good data, South Africa, we can speak of the trends. But I'm afraid, so far at least, I cannot generalize based on these trends and say, okay, this is what really has driven inequality in sub-Saharan Africa as countries.
Fair point, fair point. Just zooming out a little bit, you know, it's interesting that you compare the huge heterogeneity in inequality levels in Africa with Latin America. I mean, you know, historically, those two were the continents where colonialism, whatever phrase you want to do, really ran riot, exploited a lot of the natural resources. What do you think helps explain kind of this, at a meta level again, why it is that outcomes were so different between the two continents, subcontinents? If you have given it any thought.
Yes, although on the other hand, you know, there are parts of Africa with high inequality where they are similar to Latin America. And even if you can now, when we look now, just one small detail, when we look at Indian inequality in income, not inequality in consumption as we have been doing for a long time, India is also a country with very similar level of inequality. So you can, for example, take India, South Africa, and Brazil, and they would basically fit in the same box of very high inequality, Gini over 50. So there are similarities. But going back historically, it's hard for me to say. Both continents had plentiful of land. So, for example, land to labor ratio was very high, which of course meant essentially that land per se was available. So you actually didn't have the situation that you had, for example, in countries like certainly in China or India, where actually the opposite was the case. So, you know, one of the factors of production, like land in Africa, was plentiful. So that was, of course, the difference. And to some extent, you would expect that to lead to lower inequality. Then I think maybe it goes back historically, the role of colonialism reinforcing the extractive structures which did exist prior to colonialism.
Of course.
So that was really, technically, it's the extraction of surplus by the elites. And these elites were African originally, but also European. Interestingly, there is work on what is used using social tables, which list different major groups of population with their population shares and incomes. And there is work on several African countries. And what stands out is, of course, the colonialists had an incredibly high income compared to the rest of the population.
Of course, of course. Okay, very, very helpful, Branko. So maybe drill down to a little bit to the countries that you said we have somewhat good data in terms of exploring the trends. One of the charts you advanced beforehand, and really very grateful for that, shows, in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, inequality having been remained high and broadly at that level for a while, whereas Ethiopia is the other country on which we have data, and inequality there seems to have increased in this period of very high growth. Of course, and the other contrast is, I think, at least for that period, growth in Ethiopia was much higher than the other countries. Is this simply Ethiopian inequality perhaps having been too low relative to other countries, and the Kuznets
kind of
effect?
I would actually tend to see, and you correct me, but I would tend to see Ethiopia as fairly similar to China. For many reasons, even structurally, sort of federalist countries. China is technically not a federalist, but like federalist. But also with low inequality to start with fast growth, and thereby increase in inequality. And likewise, when you look at China really follows the Kuznets curve. Kuznets curve is not so popular anymore, which I think is a mistake, because Kuznets defined it, I think, and I argue that in global inequality, for one period of technological development. He didn't define it for several, but we can simply translate it. And I think that China, if you just simply chart the evolution of China, it follows really Kuznets quite well. And now it is a plateau of inequality, and maybe it would go down if the government decides to increase consumption and to do much more in terms of transfers, precisely what Kuznets expected. So to me, Ethiopia seems to follow the same pattern as China did. And that's how I would explain the increase of inequality, linked to high growth rates.
Very interesting. South Africa. I mean, South Africa defies a lot of what we see in the rest of Africa, in that its inequality levels is very high. Then again, of course, the structure of production, the structure of inequality there that pre-existed from the apartheid years was also just defies anything we see in the rest of the continent. Do we just leave it at that? Then again, over the last 30 years, nothing has changed, despite a lot of other things. So your take on this unique inequality landscape in South Africa?
South Africa is really quite interesting, because if you had asked this question at the time of the end of apartheid, let's suppose you have asked this question in 1990, people would say, well, it seems logical that inequality would be reduced. You had a new government. The new government was basically supported by the population that was disenfranchised before. So without anything being sort of nationalized or taken over, simply there would be a significant part of the population who would be in favor of some redistribution through taxation or whatever. What happened is the opposite, actually. Inequality increased. We have had, of course, the creation of a significant black upper middle class or top class and so on. So it was really different from what people expected. Now that inequality, we have to be also to recognize that inequality is super high, but it's not increasing. Maybe there is simply no room for it to increase any further. But it is a different case, I think, than Ethiopia, because of much lower growth. And on the other hand, interesting thing about South Africa is a relatively rich country. So it does have more room for a distribution or for social transfers or things like expansion of education and so on than poorer countries. But it doesn't seem to have used that very much. So I would see South African case of, differently. And then there is, of course, the case of Nigeria, where we really, it seems to be high inequality. The data are a little bit over the place, but it doesn't seem to have increased.
Yeah, no, as you said, hasn't increased, but there are definitely some trends which, at least at the broadest level, seem to correlate also with the level of oil prices.
Yes, exactly.
When oil prices are high, it seems inequality seems to be coming down. Again, very broad trends, but difficult to unpack. Just zooming back out a little bit, Branko, one of the consequences of this last 40, 50 years is that we seem to be having, in the 80s, more of a bimodal distribution of global income, like with the advanced countries at one end, and then a lot of poor people at another end, and the two quite apart. But over the last 30, 40 years, we've seen kind of more of a unimodal distribution of global income. A point you make in your recent work is that China's no longer, part of it is this shift of Chinese people, to closer and closer to the left, to higher income categories. It seems to leave Africa and maybe South Asia at the tail end. So should we be happy that we have more of a unimodal distribution of income now? But then again, of course, still a lot of people at the poor end, mainly in Africa.
I think we should be happy, to be quite, to be blunt, And let me explain why. Because as you were saying, until the turn of the century, we had what also Danny Kwok called twin peaks. Mm-hmm. There was a very big peak at the low level, which was essentially the middles, because you have still bunching of the middle within a country, India, Bangladesh, China, and so on. Then you had really an emptiness in the middle, which was interesting, middle global income distribution. So it was really peak, and then an emptiness, and then there was another smaller peak, which is the rich countries. And that has really changed. I think it is a dramatic change, and whoever has worked with the data is just simply observing a change where now the distribution of the world looks almost log normal like a distribution in an individual country. Almost. I'm not saying we are there, but we have really the middle, which is really like, as people know, the bell curve, except that, of course, you put incomes in logarithmic terms, and so that, to some extent, it, reduces the differences, visually reduces differences. And so we have this unimodal distribution now. And I think it's a good thing because the world has become less divided by the place of residence. However, that's the second part. It's really done mostly thanks to China. So if once you take China out, and then especially if you take India out, you really don't see much of a change. And so we have to be quite aware, including myself, because I tended to overestimate, I think, too much this unimodality. And I still believe it is crucial. But we have to see that that unimodality and that kind of convergence is really driven only by one part of the world. Another part really did not converge. And we have to admit to that and actually think likewise like what to do next in order that it should be a more generally convergent world.
So a natural follow-up to this, of course, is that the convergence has happened as a result of very high growth. And you point out that in many African countries, periods of high growth have been few and far between. First, if you could comment on all of that. And then second, then I'll come back to you at what factors may be at work.
Yes, that is true. Actually, I looked, as you know, I looked at I posed myself the following question. Because growth is absolutely crucial for the reduction of global inequality. And that's, I think, an important point to make, is when people are concerned about global inequality, growth does most of the job. It doesn't do 100% of the job, but it does 80 or 90% of the job. So this is the irony. It's actually, you need growth, actually, and growth among poorer countries, and particularly among the populous countries. Now, when you look at actually record of Africa versus Asia since 1960, you have, of course, many more instances of Asian countries having sustained growth, where I actually said, okay, let me find the episodes where you had 5 years of consecutive growth of at least 5% per capita. It's significant, it's not dramatic, but it requires like 5 years. It's not easy to maintain. And there you really see a big difference between Asia, which had like many countries to have fulfilled that criterion, maybe sometimes 5 years, sometimes 8, 9, China for 30 years, which is really total outlier. And we had only Ethiopia among the large countries in Africa to have done that for 14 years. And the other countries that did were either single commodity producers like Cote d'Ivoire or really small countries like Equatorial Guinea. So that's really the contrast. Now you say, okay, what can I expect in the future? And I have to be there modest and to be, how should I say, not deprecatory, but we have to really look at what economists have said. And I always think of what Myrdal was writing just before the takeoff of Asia, when he was very skeptical. He wrote 2 volumes called The Asian Drama. So maybe when we now look at the past and say Africa hasn't done that, we should not be too confident that we can extrapolate. It could be that artificial intelligence, new technology, electronics, financial fintech, and so on, might push Africa much further and faster than we can anticipate.
Okay. We'll try and unpack that in a bit, Branko, if we may. But just on the picture you just painted of Africa having been subject to not having experienced these periods of sustained growth. I'm always struck by that, of course, and always try and step back and think about what broader reasons there may be. One thing from being a little bit of a student of economic history, one thing that I see having helped countries in, be it the former Soviet Union, China, other Asian countries, having helped them, of course, is that do this, great leap forward, as it were. They have had periods where they were able to extract surplus of some kind for a sustained period of time on the back of very, very strong state capacity. Now, of course, this is not always the case, and in countries like India, of course, you have episodes of high growth in a much more contested environment. So, what are your thoughts in terms of these factors at work at the present moment, especially when the broader dynamics of development have changed?
I'm glad that you asked me this question. I'm going to go totally out of a limb because it's really something that is not an area that I think defend as strongly as I can defend inequality numbers. But I'm not convinced by the arguments, for example, that Danny Roderick and others have made about premature deindustrialization and, in generally speaking, inability of countries to develop without sustained industrialization. And I'm afraid that we may be doing, when we do that, we are projecting what has happened in the past and what was reasonable, and we believe that it has to continue like that. I cannot see why the introduction of new technologies, which may not require like producing things, is necessarily, how should I say, impeding or meaning that you would not be able to become rich. It seems to me that we are in a different technological world where maybe it's not manufacturing anymore that is sine qua non of development. And if this is true, then maybe, again, this is all sort of very speculative, maybe that the amount of accumulation that you need and surplus that you basically have to extract and invest, maybe you don't need such dramatic things as we did in the past. The Industrial Revolution in England, Soviet collectivization, Chinese also ability to extract surplus to stop labor from coming, actually to hire it under much worse conditions by not giving it the rights of residency and so on. So maybe you don't need to have like 30% of GDP in investments.
I think this is a good point to transition also a little bit in a forward-looking sense about this technology and labor, whether they're complements or substitutes, also implications for inequality, of course. So a couple of questions in this vein. I mean, first, I don't know, maybe deluded, but I tend to be very, very optimistic about the prospects for Africa. Because when I started my career in 1992, I mean, you know, if you had said to me 30 years on, 35 years on, Africa would be where it is, I would have said, what are you smoking? Because it was such a grim period, and yet, you know,
yes, yeah.
huge improvement, not necessarily on the dimension of income, but other dimensions, you know, of development, life expectancy, etc., have improved massively. And I think the effects of that were going to be playing out. When I see all the bearishness about the region right now, I also think about going forward what the global trends are and how they will impact and with the countries. And one of the things, of course, that will be unfolding going forward is demographics. You know, in the next 8-10 years, 1 out of every 2 new entrants into the global labor force will come from sub-Saharan Africa. So the juxtaposition of young, dynamic population in Africa versus aging population in the world would mean that a lot of labor available in Africa. But then that is tempered a little bit by, despite all your writings, you know, which suggest that we shouldn't worry about this lump of labor fallacy, etc.
Right,
I also worry about what the advent of AI will mean.
You know, going back to what I was actually also saying before, I have to say that I'm pretty optimistic for Africa for one peculiar reason, because I think that the new technology and artificial intelligence would be good for Africa. The reason is the following. There is lots of young people who are coming. If the educational system is acceptably good, that means that you have simply quantity of people who are young, who are not living in the past, so they are unencumbered with past ways of doing things, so they would actually move. And we see that Africa actually in the use of modern technologies, advanced technologies, is actually quite good. You know, with famous examples of system of payment, with the use of a mobile phone for everything. Yeah. So there is an advance there, which I was saying before. Maybe it doesn't require also 30%, capital accumulation. And then there, to me, seems the first condition, which is really absolutely crucial, is no wars. You mentioned 1990s. 1990s were really very bad period precisely because of the conflict. So that's the first one. Education of young people, that's really a big thing, because if other parts of the world have no inflow of young people, it doesn't matter you have great educational system, but if nobody's there to be taught, what do you do with its educational system? So that's the advantage of Africa. And then infrastructural development, which I think is really also crucial for many reasons that you know much better, so there is no point in discussing that. But if you have really education, infrastructural development, and peace, I think then basically this demographic dividend would really play in Africa's favor.
What's striking is in your kind of prescription of the kind of things that ought to be pursued, I don't see policies directly to attenuate inequality. Is this because of your strong belief that it's growth that's going to do all the work? Because that this contrasts a lot with the thinking in policymaking circles that tax policies have to be more progressive, you have to have social protection to try and take care of the most vulnerable. What are your thoughts on that?
That's so, I don't want to, I mean, after all, I spent my entire life working on inequality, so I believe it's a very important topic. And obviously, I believe that for countries where you have very high inequality, like South Africa, we talked before, you have to do something about it. And actually, social transfers and increased taxation to fund the social transfers is one way. But I think when you have significantly lower level of income, I think it's really, there is not much to distribute to start with. So really, growth is absolutely necessary to launch the process. I remember when I was much younger and worked actually on some African countries many years ago, and we go there and you say, okay, this is social, whatever, social transmission, whatever it's called. But when you look at the budget, when you look at the amount, if you tax 10% and you cannot tax more of GDP, where is the amount to distribute? And there are lots of people. And so I think that if in most of the countries it is currently, except for the outlier in terms of inequality. But for the others, I would not put the emphasis on redistribution. I think really growth to me comes first. And obviously then, inequality can begin to and can be an impediment to growth. But currently, I really don't, I'm not saying it doesn't matter, I'm just saying if you have priorities, my priority would be growth.
Okay. So just if I could probe a little bit on this, I mean, one of the challenges, of course, is that governments are facing. Say you are an oil exporting country, your tax GDP ratio is low.
Yeah.
People are reluctant to give you more taxes that you need to invest in health or infrastructure because they don't feel like they're getting anything from the income that government is generating. So this is often like a vice that governments are caught in. Even in those circumstances, you don't see a need for more distributive policies?
No, I do in general, but I think the argument that you just mentioned is the unwillingness to be taxed because you fear that basically the tax money would go into the hands of government. And, for sort of higher incomes, buying houses in Paris and stuff like that. So I think that there is really a sort of negative, it seems to me, popular perception for increased taxation because of the loss of trust in government in many places. And if you have that was a further argument against emphasis on redistribution per se. As I say, I think that in some cases, high inequality is an impediment for growth, clearly. And I would say South Africa is maybe one case. Yeah. But I think in the other cases, emphasizing redistribution in conditions of relatively low income, in conditions of lack of trust of government, and thereby impossibly undermining growth becomes really essentially a self-fulfilling prophecy where you always stay at the same level. And so that's why I'm, strangely enough, not in favor of emphasizing redistribution at some relatively low levels of income.
Thanks. One thing that I'm a bit haunted by when I read your Substack and your books as time allows, one thing I'm haunted by is one thing you wrote that when you were at the bank, having done some work on subsidies in former Soviet Union,
right,
which
Poland,
which the inclination was to try and remove them because they were untargeted, etc. But subsidies for fuel, winter fuel. But untargeted as they were actually quite pro-poor in the past. And I'm always kind of haunted by that because the advice that, when we look at untargeted subsidies, general subsidies, is to try and remove them. What are the things that we may be blind to, as we perhaps were back in the early 90s in the former Soviet Union?
It's of course easier to say, sort of after the fact where we were blind and what we did wrongly. But in that particular case, I'm glad you mentioned it because we were definitely wrong in that. We were wrong because the prior was, let's get rid of all subsidies, whatever. And there were indeed some subsidies which are pro-poor, and they were reasonably, how should I say, well administered, and that they made sense. But we then had this very strongly neoliberal view that all subsidies are bad, and then we are going to abolish the general subsidies, and then we will give it to the needy groups. And really, in many cases, that doesn't work. And I mentioned the fuel subsidy. I mentioned also, for example, transportation. That I remember quite well. People of a certain age and some background, whether they were a part of the Great Patriotic War, meaning the Second World War, and so on, had free transport. And then you take away all of that, and you say, okay, I will give you only based on your need. It's a major shock to people. And when I go here and I see there are, of course, advantages to the older people which are given. If you go to a movie theater in New York, if you're older, you get a special subsidy. If you go transportation, you get a special subsidy. So it's not that subsidies were unknown here. But we went with I think in those days, with a very sort of narrow perspective where we a priori decided they should all be finished. And I think in some cases we were wrong.
Okay, so you're arguing for more nuance and...
much more nuanced, yes. Okay. Much more nuanced. Let me just say also that what I said before about Africa, I was not necessarily against, for example, subsidies that we believe either are pro-poor or easy to administer and things which do make sense.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how many of them exist because in many countries, you might not even have them or whatever. But we have, I think, to go case by case and not to have an a priori statement that we would like to get rid of all of them, or to actually keep even the ones that are totally meaningless. And obviously, we know historically there is subsidy, like you take Egypt, subsidy on bread. We know that historically, politically, it's something that you cannot remove unless you want, government to explode. So we know that. So we cannot ignore the history. I mean, that history has been taught very well, I think, in quite a few instances.
Yeah. I mean, for what it's worth, I mean, one of the things we try and do now is accept that these are deeply domestic and political decisions that countries make, and just to have it transparently budgeted, transparently on the books, and have some debate in society over it. And if countries insist that that is the way they want to go, that's fine. But I mean, the trade-offs, I think, making those explicit is one thing we push for.
Absolutely.
So, Branko, one last question from my side is, like, anything else that you have by way of advice for international institutions like us as we work with countries at this really, really difficult juncture?
I think the juncture today is very difficult, first for the reasons that we mentioned before, because I think it's an end of an era. So whenever it's an end of an era, you kind of wonder, like, what is now the rule, When I was mentioning, and you mentioned, for example, when I was working in the World Bank, in the 80s and the 90s, right? The neoliberalism was the rule. It was fairly clear what to do. The Washington Consensus was very simple. It is a reasonable consensus, but it was, of course, applied somewhat extravagantly, but it's very reasonable. Nowadays, we are in a situation where we don't know exactly what is reasonable. And on the other hand, we are also in a technological revolution. We talked about that with artificial intelligence, with possibly increasing share of capital, which is always unequalizing, simply because the capital is owned by relatively few people. And so we are really in a new situation where I believe we don't have the rules yet, and we have to look at things really basically in a very nuanced, as you said, way. So I would not have a general sort of proposition. As maybe you can say, generally speaking, I was not so much in favor of redistribution in poor countries. So maybe that's kind of a more general thing.
Okay. If I may, one thing, when you mentioned the word Washington Consensus, always kind of makes my ears perk a bit, because, when the consensus was being formulated a little bit post 1990, 93, 94, I was actually working for government at the time, and we were doing some reforms in Ethiopia, but not because we knew anything about Washington Consensus or even what the World Bank and IMF had said, but more because what had been practiced on the ground was not working, and we felt the need for change. And I'm always, when I came back, I realized that it's meant to be all under the rubric of Washington Consensus, and I felt kind of, that there was so much, I don't know, glorifying of what was happening in Washington, wanting to label what all change that's happening by in terms of Washington or G1 or whatever U.S. policy. And is that something that we have to be guard against? I mean, that the sense that intellectual things all emerge from Washington.
You're basically saying that essentially you were the Washington Consensus people before the Washington Consensus was defined.
Well, to be clear, what we were seeing in Ethiopia, for example, was that collectivization had not helped increase yields. So that maybe you needed more pragmatic policies, leaving things to the ground. I mean, macro policies were not so much out of whack, but there were other things like the exchange rate. It was clear that was out of whack. And we needed to do something a bit more differently. But I don't think any of us were referring to what was happening in Washington at the time. We just could see what was on the ground.
Of course, you're totally right, actually. It must have happened. But the advantage of Washington, I have to say, is that when he spoke of the consensus, he meant the IMF, the World Bank, the Treasury, and the economists around. And the power of Washington is that it is a place where everybody gathers. It is able to define something, whatever it is, and then projects that. Now, as you said, actually, many of the elements were done independently. The issue is that we are still, in terms of knowledge generation, dependent on Washington, on the West, and on the main institutions that are here. So, that knowledge, for example, that Ethiopia had, it was maybe more difficult to transfer that knowledge from Ethiopia to Bolivia. But once it was centralized, as it were, here, then the transmission became easier. So I think that role of the international organizations is still important for sort of creation of rules. Am I right on that?
For transmission, I don't know rules so much, but as a conduit for what works and what doesn't work.
Conduit, okay.
Definitely. I mean, that's very much our role. But always kind of, I think we underestimate kind of how much we learn also from or we try to learn at least from what we see on the ground working and not working.
That's absolutely true, but I think the conduit probably is a better word, but also putting a name on something is important, because it becomes then a catchphrase. It's simple to understand, and actually, it was John Williamson did a very good job on that. When you look at all 10 of them, they all make sense, but the problem with that was that actually it was applied without regard to anything else, and was done in a somewhat, how should I say, maybe in extreme versions in some cases. So, but it was not a bad sort of bad idea.
Branko, thank you so much for this incredibly interesting discussion. I think we've covered the ground quite a bit. We've covered quite a bit of ground. Again, thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. It was, as I said, a pleasure. It is, well, this is the place for the conduit of information. Well, we have done a little bit of that.
Hopefully. Thank you all for watching, and look forward to presenting to you another provocative and interesting thinker like Branko next time. Thank you.